Hello, my name's Tom Haddigan. I'm the author and the creator of this new course based on the musicology of the Beatles. It's planned to be a 15-week course studying the musicology of the Beatles. This is just an introduction, which I've titled Unlocking the Music of the Beatles. So this is me, far right. This is my education channel. I have some other channels based on sports, mostly MMA and boxing. And I have other channels based on education, including language education. So this is Introduction to Beatles, Musicology, Beatles 101. So this is me. Now I'm going to play you a podcast.
All right, so ever feel like music has like a whole secret code? You're enjoying a song, but you have no idea how it actually works.
Yeah, like you can tap your foot, but you don't know why.
Yeah, get ready because today we're taking a deep dive into the magic of music theory with the Beatles as our guide.
The Beatles, hold on, didn't those guys basically learn by ear? Like no fancy music schools for them, right?
Exactly, and that's what makes this so cool. They created these insanely sophisticated tunes, stuff that still blows us away decades later. And they did it almost purely on instinct. So imagine what happens when we decode their work. It's like we're peeking behind the curtain of music itself.
Oh, wow. So you're saying we can actually learn the language of music just by listening to the Beatles. I am so...
You got it. Think of it like this. Have you ever tried to read a book in a language you don't know?
Oh, yeah. Totally frustrated.
It's like, what's going on? Music theory is like learning the alphabet and the grammar of music. So suddenly, you're not just hearing sounds. You're understanding the whole story the music is telling.
And what better storytellers than the Beatles? I mean, from love songs to like psychedelic trips, they covered it all.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
First, the basics. We got to start with pitch.
Yeah.
That's how high or low a note is.
Uh-huh.
You know, yesterday, McCartney's voice soaring high. That's pitch. Then there's rhythm. The heartbeat of the music, the driving beat in She Loves You that makes you want to move.
Oh, yeah.
That's rhythm doing its thing.
Okay, rhythm and pitch. Got it. But music's more than just single notes, right?
Right. Now we're talking melody. A series of notes that create a tune you can hum along to. Like, what about the instantly recognizable melody of Hey Jude? Then we have harmony. This is where things get really interesting.
Ooh, harmony. Because harmony is all about chords. Multiple notes played together to create a mood or a feeling.
You got it. Imagine a simple three-note chord like a C major triad. By itself, it's pleasant, but kind of basic. But now just stack a minor seventh on top.
Okay.
Boom. You got this richer, more complex sound. This is all over Beatles tunes.
So that's how they create all those emotions. But how do they string those chords together?
That, my friend, is called a chord progression. It's basically the roadmap of a song's harmony. You know, the iconic progression in Let It Be that just tugs at your heartstrings. That's it. And then all these elements come together within a key, which is like the home base for all the notes and chords in a song.
Wow. It's amazing how all these elements come together. I'm already starting to hear music differently.
That's awesome. But before we jump into deciphering Beatles hits, we need to understand where their sound came from. Imagine them as young lads in Liverpool, soaking up influences like skiffle.
Skiffle. Okay, now that's a word I haven't heard in a while. Break that down for us.
Picture this. DIY rock and roll. Using washboards, T-chest basses, anything they could get their hands on. It was raw, energetic, and incredibly resourceful.
So they were like musical MacGyvers?
Totally.
That's so cool.
And don't forget the huge influence of American rock and roll. Like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard.
Yeah.
These guys were like musical superheroes to the young Beatles.
Yeah, and that energy and that rawness totally comes through in their early music. Take Twist and Shout, for example. That's pure rock and roll energy fueled by those early influences.
You nailed it. But they weren't just copying their heroes. They were absorbing those influences and transforming them into something unique. And that's where their Hamburg gears come in.
Hamburg. Wasn't that where they basically lived in clubs, playing for hours on end?
Exactly. It wasn't just about the music. It was about stamina improvisation, connecting with a live audience. Think of it as their musical boot camp.
Oh, wow. So they weren't just playing covers anymore. They were developing their own sound, their own stage presence.
It was a crucible that forged their unique style and that incredible tightness as a band. And while Hamburg was shaping their musical core, back in England, another key figure entered the picture. Brian Epstein. Okay, so imagine this. You're a young band from Liverpool. You've paid your dues in Hamburg. You've honed your skills. And now you've got this sharp-dressed manager who believes in you. What happens next?
Boom, Beatlemania. They just explode onto the scene, capture the world's attention. It's a whirlwind of screaming fans, hit records, and a cultural shift that we're still feeling today.
It's crazy how quickly they went from those gritty Hamburg clubs to global superstardom. But here's the thing. Amidst all the chaos, they were also churning out some of the most innovative pop music ever written.
And this is where, like, the magic of Lennon-McCartney's songwriting partnership really shines. Two distinct voices, each with their own style, their own perspective, coming together to create something truly extraordinary.
Yeah, it's like they were completing each other's musical sentences.
Yeah.
Lennon raw, emotional. Some is even a bit cynical. And then you've got McCartney melodic, whimsical, with a knack for crafting those unforgettable hooks.
And you can totally hear that contrast in their songwriting. Think about the vulnerability of Lennon's Help compared to the hopeful optimism of McCartney's Let It Be. It's like two sides of the same coin, perfectly balanced.
I love that. And as they matured as songwriters,
Yeah.
their music evolved too. Remember those basic chords we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, they weren't content to stay in that lane. They started incorporating more complex harmonies, experimenting with different chord progressions.
Like take If I Fell from a Hard Day's Night. It's a beautiful song. But what makes it so unique is the use of chromaticism. It's like they're adding these unexpected notes outside the usual scale, creating this bittersweet feeling that perfectly matches the lyrics about the fragility of love.
Wait, back up a sec. Chromaticism. That sounds fancy. Break it down for us non-music theory folks.
Okay, think of it like adding spices to a dish. Like a simple melody is like a basic recipe, but chromaticism throws in those unexpected flavors. It adds depth and complexity. You hear it in classical music too. But the Beatles were weaving it into pop songs, which was pretty groundbreaking at the time.
So they're spicing up their melodies, they're experimenting with harmonies, and let's not forget that iconic opening chord in A Hard Day's Night. Music theorists are still debating what it is, but that ambiguity is part of what makes it so captivating.
It's like they're saying, hey, we don't have to follow the rules. We can create our own. And that spirit of experimentation, that's at the heart of what makes them so revolutionary.
And speaking of revolutions, Rubber Soul is where things really take a turn. They'd conquered the world with Beatlemania, but now they were looking inward, exploring new sonic landscapes.
Yeah, it's like they were saying, okay, we've written the love songs, we've rocked out, now it's time to dig a little deeper. And that's where you start to hear the influence of folk music, introspective lyrics, and a willingness to experiment with new instruments.
Like the sitar in Norwegian Wood. That was a pretty bold move for a pop band in 1965. It's like they were taking a trip to India without even leaving the studio.
And that's what's so fascinating about this period. They're blending these diverse influences, folk soul, even Eastern sounds, all while maintaining that distinct Beatles sound.
And they weren't just expanding their musical vocabulary, they were also pushing the boundaries of the recording studio, multi-tracking tape loops. They were turning the studio into an instrument itself.
Imagine them in the studio, like mad scientists, experimenting with these new tools, drive my car, with that punchy horn section and that tight groove. It's a great example of how they were using the studio to create a bigger, more dynamic sound.
And let's not forget the influence of soul music. You hear it all over Rubber Soul and Revolver. Think about the vocal harmonies in You Won't See Me, or the driving rhythm of Gotta Get You Into My Life. It's like they were channeling that Motown magic.
And then you have Revolver, where their studio experimentation goes into hyperdrive, songs like Tomorrow Never Knows or like Sonic Journeys, using backwards recording tape loops and all sorts of mind-bending effects to create this otherworldly atmosphere.
It's wild to think they were doing this in the mid-'60s, way before computers and digital audio workstations. They were literally splicing tape together, experimenting with speed variations, all to achieve these groundbreaking sounds.
You know, John Lennon famously said he wanted Tomorrow Never Knows to sound like Tibetan monks chanting on a mountaintop. And you know what? They actually pulled it off. It's a testament to their fearlessness and their endless creativity.
This is the Beatles, at the most experimental funking out, pushing the boundaries of what music could be. But hold on tight, because we're about to enter the era of concept albums, where they take their studio wizardry and their sonic adventures to a whole new level. Okay, so we've gone from those early skiffle days to the mind-bending sounds of Revolver. But get ready, because things are about to get even wilder.
Oh, yeah. We're entering the era of Strat Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This is the album that redefined what a pop album could be. It wasn't just a collection of songs. It was an experience, a sonic world you could step right into.
Remember how we talked about the studio becoming an instrument? Well, with Strat Pepper,
Yeah.
Beatles turned the studio into a whole orchestra, a sound laboratory, like a portal to another dimension.
Totally. They were layering sounds, using tape loops and effects. Like they were painting with sound. And they weren't afraid to get weird, like being for the benefit of Mr. Kite. It sounds like a psychedelic circus. And then you have A Day in the Life with that epic orchestral crescendo.
Oh, yeah.
Still gives me chills.
Speaking of A Day in the Life, can we talk about how they created that sound? It's like this explosion of orchestral chaos, and then it all comes crashing back down to earth.
Well, they actually recorded multiple orchestras, playing at once, each with different instructions. It was like controlled chaos, a carefully orchestrated explosion of sound. They were literally pushing the limits of what recording technology could do.
It's mind-blowing to think they were doing this in the 1960s, using techniques that would influence generations of musicians.
Right.
They weren't just making music, they were inventing new ways to make music.
And it wasn't just the sound that was groundbreaking. Spark Pepper was a concept album. It told a story through the music. And the Beatles even created these alter egos for themselves. It blurred the lines between reality and their art.
It's like they were saying, we're not just a band anymore, we're artists.
Yeah.
And we can create whatever we want.
Yeah.
And they did. From the whimsical lyrics of When I'm 64 to the introspective beauty of She's Leaving Home, they explored so many emotions and themes with incredible depth.
And don't forget that album cover, a collage of famous faces, like a visual representation of this cultural melting pot that the Beatles themselves had become. It was like art imitating life, imitating art, a perfect picture of the psychedelic era.
So we've covered a lot, from their humble beginnings to their status as global icons who redefine music and culture. What can we take away from this deep dive into the Beatles' musical evolution?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the Beatles never stopped learning. They never stopped experimenting. They embraced new sounds, new technologies, and they always pushed themselves creatively. They were masters, but they never lost that sense of playfulness and wonder.
They were like sponges, soaking up influences from everywhere, and then filtering them through their own lens. And that's what made them so special. They were constantly evolving, pushing the boundaries.
Inspiring countless artists along the way.
I mean, think about it. They started with skiffle and rock and roll, but then they incorporated elements of folk, soul, classical, even Eastern music. They weren't afraid to break the rules, to try new things, and that's what led to those groundbreaking innovations. And that spirit of experimentation, that willingness to push boundaries, that's something we can all learn from, whether you're a musician, a writer, or just someone who loves exploring new ideas. The Beatles' journey is a reminder that there are always new worlds to discover, new ways to express yourself, new stories to tell.
The beauty of music is that it's a universal language. It goes beyond borders, languages, cultural differences. And the Beatles, with their timeless melodies, their innovative sounds, and their message of peace and love, they continue to speak to us today, just as powerfully as they did decades ago.
So there you have it, a deep dive into the music of the Beatles. From those early days in Liverpool to the psychedelic landscapes of Spark Pepper, they left a mark on music history, and their legacy continues to inspire and amaze us. It reminds us that the only limit to creativity is our own imagination. Now go out there, explore the world of music, and see what sonic adventures you can uncover.
Okay, we will be looking at foundational concepts, the value of music theory. How does music theory enhance listening enjoyment? I'll be looking at the emotional, intellectual, and physical responses that music evokes, referencing how structure creates these effects. I'll be discussing the benefits of understanding compositional, performance, and recording techniques. I'll summarize the Beatles' musical journey and their cultural impact. I'll explain why their music, despite their lack of formal theory training, is suitable for theoretical analysis, and how does studying the Beatles bridge the gap between complex theory and popular music. We'll be looking at some musical terminology: pitch, rhythm, melody, harmony, texture, timbre, form. I'll be defining and differentiating the differences between chord, triad, seventh chord, chord progression, looking at the differences between major, minor keys and how they affect the emotional quality of music. We'll be looking at some analytical tools, explaining the function of Roman numerals and figured bass in musical analysis. what information can be gleaned, for example, from a lead sheet, who uses a lead sheet. We'll be discussing or describing the process of analytical listening. And we'll also be looking at these various time zones in the Beatles' experience. From 1956, the genre of music and their partnership. Skiffle's impact. We'll be describing the characteristics of skiffle music and its influence on the nascent Beatles. How did the do-it-yourself nature of skiffle foster experimentation and songwriting? Then we'll be looking at American rock and roll's influences. We'll be looking at the impact of American rock and roll figures, Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard on the Beatles' early style. I'll have a look at the 12-bar blues form and its common chord progressions. We'll have a look at one of the early McCartney-Lennon songs, In Spite of All the Danger. Through musical analysis, I'll be identifying the blues influences in the early Quarrymen song. I'm just thinking that it might be a Harrison McCartney song. I'll have to look at that. I'll be discussing the song structure, instrumentation, and the recording limitations of the time. Then looking at the Lennon-McCartney dynamic, tracing the formation of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership. I'll be describing the unique strengths each brought to the collaborative process. Paul details how he and John would skive off school and go to one of their houses, mostly his house, I believe, to experiment with writing songs. It's interesting that we tend to use in many parts of the UK skiving, but McCartney uses a different term. Then we'll look at the Hamburg years, the Hamburg Crucible. How did the Beatles' Hamburg residencies impact their performance skills and their musical development? We'll be discussing the influence of the club atmosphere and exposure to German rock and roll. How did these experiences affect their stamina, improvisation, song extension abilities? We'll be looking at the Hamburg recordings and analysing them. We'll select a live Hamburg era recording for analysis. We'll examine its structure, performance energy, improvisational elements. We'll be looking at their expanding repertoire, discussing the Beatles' range of covers from this period and their value in learning about songwriting, arrangement and performance. We'll be looking at the evolution of instrumental styles, analysing the individual playing styles developing during the Hamburg years. We'll look at Lennon and Harrison's use of riffs, lead lines and blues techniques. We'll look at McCartney's increasing melodic bass lines. And we'll look at the stylistic differences between Ringo Starr and Best. Then we'll go on to section 4, Beatlemania and the early success. We'll be looking at Brian Epstein's role, Brian Epstein's significance in the Beatles' transformation into a polished, marketable act. How did his management style shape their image, secure contracts, promote their music? We'll be analysing the early EMI recordings, such as Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, etc., etc. We'll be analysing those two songs in particular, identifying blues influences, structures, early rock songwriting craft. We'll discuss George Martin's role as a producer and his initial influence on their sound. We'll have a look at the global phenomenon of Beatlemania, describing the cultural impact of Beatlemania on music, fashion and youth culture globally. We'll be explaining how their music resonated with the generation amid social and cultural change. And then we'll be looking at studio exploration and musical growth from Rubber Soul to Sgt. Pepper's. We'll have a look at Rubber Soul as a case study, analysing Rubber Soul as a turning point in the Beatles' evolution, discussing its shift towards studio experimentation and more introspective songwriting. We'll look at genre influences, explain the influence of folk rock on songs like You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, analysing its use of acoustic elements and introspective lyrics. I'll be discussing the influence of soul music, for example, in the song Drive My Car, examining its melodic, vocal, and instrumental elements. Sorry, I sneezed there. Studio techniques. I'll introduce the basic studio techniques employed in this period, including multi-tracking and tape loops. And I'll discuss the impact of the Beatles' sonic landscape and songwriting process. Okay, so if you've listened to the podcast, you'll be in a position to sorry about that distraction. Okay, so then we've got a short answer quiz. So have a look at these questions and you should answer each of them in 2 to 3 sentences. So we'll go through the questions, then I'll go through the answers with you. How does understanding the music theory enhance the appreciation of music even at a casual listening level? Why are the Beatles, despite their lack of formal music training, considered suitable subjects for music theory analysis? What is the significance of the 12-bar blues structure in the development of early rock and roll? And how is it reflected in the Beatles' early music? How did the Beatles' residencies in Hamburg contribute to their growth as a band, both musically and in terms of their stage presence? What was Brian Epstein's role in the Beatles' success, and how did his management style influence their image and their career trajectory? What key stylistic shift is evident in the Rubber Soul album, and what factors contributed to this change in the Beatles' approach to music? How did the Beatles utilize studio technology and techniques to innovate their sound in the mid-60s? Provide specific examples. How did the influence of folk rock appear in the Beatles' music during the early or the mid-60s? Explain the concept of a concept album and discuss how Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band exemplifies this form. Beyond this musical innovations, how did the Beatles impact global culture in the 60s? And what aspect of their legacy continue to resonate today? So let's look at the answers. Okay, let's remind you, question number 1. How does understanding music theory enhance the appreciation of music even at a casual listening level? Well, music theory provides a framework for understanding how music is constructed, revealing the underlying structures and techniques that create emotional and intellectual responses in listeners. Even without consciously analyzing music, understanding basic theory can deepen the appreciation of how melody, harmony, rhythm and form work together to create a cohesive, impactful piece. Question 2. Why are the Beatles, despite their lack of formal music training, considered suitable subjects for music theory analysis? Well, the Beatles, though untrained in formal music theory, created a vast and complex body of work that demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of musical principles. Their music evolved significantly over their career, incorporating a wide range of influences and innovative studio techniques, making it rich ground for exploring theoretical concepts in a popular music context. Question number 3. What is the significance of the 12-bar blues structure in the development of early rock and roll, and how is it reflected in the Beatles' early music? The 12-bar blues, with its characteristic chord progression and lyrical themes, served as a foundational building block for early rock and roll. The Beatles, influenced by American blues artists, employed this structure in many of their early songs, demonstrating its adaptability and lasting influence on popular music. How did the Beatles' residencies in Hamburg contribute to their growth as a band, both musically and in terms of their stage presence? Well, the grueling performance schedule and diverse audiences in Hamburg's clubs forced the Beatles to develop their musical stamina, stage presence and improvisational skills. They honed their instrumental techniques, expanded their repertoire, and learned to connect with audiences through extended sets and energetic performances. Question number 5. What was Brian Epstein's role in the Beatles' success, and how did his management style influence their image and career trajectory? Well, Epstein, as their manager, played a crucial role in shaping the Beatles' image and guiding their career. He secured their recording contract with EMI, insisted on a professional appearance, and skillfully navigated the music industry, propelling them to international fame. Question number 6. What key stylistic shift is evident in the Rubber Soul album, and what factors contributed to this change in the Beatles' approach to music? Well, Rubber Soul marked a deep departure from the Beatles' earlier pop-orientated sound towards a more introspective and experimental style. Influences like folk rock, Eastern music, coupled with their growing interest in studio experimentation, led to more complex harmonies, unconventional song structures, and introspective lyrics. Question 7. How did the Beatles utilize studio technology and techniques to innovate their sound in the early 60s? Provide specific examples. Well, the Beatles embraced studio technology as a creative tool, using multi-tracking to layer instruments and vocals, tape loops to create psychedelic textures, and backwards recording for unique sonic effects. Songs like Tomorrow Never Knows showcase their pioneering use of the studio as an instrument in its own right. Question number 8. How did the influence of folk rock appear in the Beatles' music during the mid-60s? The rise of folk rock in the mid-60s, with its emphasis on acoustic guitars, introspective lyrics, and simple harmonies, influenced the Beatles' songwriting. Songs like You've Got to Hide Your Love Away and Norwegian Wood reflect the trend, incorporating folk elements into their pop sound. Question number 9. Explain the concept of a concept album and discuss how Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band exemplifies this form. A concept album presents a unified theme or narrative across its tracks. Moving beyond a collection of individual songs, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band exemplifies this with its fictional band persona, thematic continuity, and innovative studio techniques, creating a cohesive listening experience. And final question. Beyond their musical contributions, the Beatles impacted fashion, youth culture, and social attitudes. Their embrace of countercultural ideas, experimentation with psychological music and Eastern spirituality, and promotion of peace and love influenced a generation seeking change and challenged societal norms. Their music continues to inspire and resonate with its universal themes and innovative sounds. Okay, so here are some essay questions for you to consider. Analyze the evolution of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership, considering the individual strengths each brought to the process and how their styles converged and diverged over time. Use specific song examples to support your analysis. 2. Discuss the significance of the Beatles' Hamburg residencies in shaping their musical identity. How did these experiences inform their performance style, songwriting, and musical development? 3. Rubber Soul is often cited as a turning point in the Beatles' career, marking a shift towards a more mature and experimental sound. Analyze the album's key musical features and discuss the factors, both musical and personal, that contributed to this stylistic evolution. 4. The Beatles were pioneers in using the recording studio as a creative instrument. Discuss their innovative studio techniques, citing specific song examples, and analyze how these techniques shape the sound and possibilities of popular music. 5. Explore the lasting legacy of the Beatles on popular music and culture. Analyze their impact on subsequent generations of musicians, and discuss the reasons for the enduring popularity and relevance of their music. And now I'm going to just name some key terms that you need to have a look at. So I will just name them, and you can use the screen to just read through the definitions. So we're going to look at 12-bar blues. We're going to look at Beatlemania. We're going to look at chords, chord progressions, concept albums. I'll introduce you to figured bass, folk rock, harmony, lead sheets, who uses lead sheets, melody, modal mixtures, multi-tracking, pitch, psychedelic rock, rhythm, Roman numerals, soul music, skiffle, studio techniques, tape loops, texture, timbre, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.